All right, well, I think I'll go ahead and get things started. So welcome to our January program for Santa Barbara Audubon Society. Aaron Kreisberg with our other program co-chair, Emily Kreisberg. And just make sure if you should have been muted when you came in, but if you're not muted, make sure you mute yourself. And then we will have opportunities for questions. So you can put questions in the chat. And if they don't get addressed during the presentation, we'll get to them at the end. The program will be recorded for folks to rewatch, or if you're unable to attend, you can watch it later. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to our executive director, Catherine, for announcements. So thanks.
Thank you, Aaron and Emily. And first of all, I wanted to say Happy New Year to everyone. I also wanted to welcome Maureen Russell, who is our new board chair of communications. She sent out her first email blast about tonight's program, and it was fabulous. Thank you, Maureen. Second, bird walks and field trips are on pause through February. Please check our website for updates. Third, I want to thank Alex and Joyce for their beautiful work on El Tecolote. Betsy Mooney has found our new ET layout designer, CJ Oliverson, as Alex focuses on her growing business. So thank you, Alex, for all that great work you have been doing. I also want to thank everyone who donated towards the annual appeal. We made the $10,000 match by Darlene Sherman and Julie Kummel. We are excited about all the great conservation, science, and education work that we are doing this winter and spring. I just got off an education committee meeting and there's a lot of great work going on. For example, our signature Meet Your Wild Neighbor elementary school outreach program is resuming in local schools this winter with now 2 Meet Your Wild Neighbor teachers. We hired a second because of the popularity of the program and our growth. And last but not least, thank you, Aaron and Emily, for setting up tonight's program. And thank you, Xerónimo, for presenting.
All right, I'll mute myself here and I'll do a quick intro and pass it off. So I'd like to introduce our speaker, Xerónimo Castañeda. He's a conservation project director with Audubon California. He's a California native who lived and worked from Monterey to Arcata and did his graduate work at Humboldt State and worked with Point Blues. So definitely has conservation experience and has found his way to Sacramento, where he works with Audubon California on conservation projects that we'll get to hear a bit more about tonight. Away from work, Xerónimo likes spending time at home, riding bikes, cooking, and of course birding. And then what we'll be hearing about tonight, he'll talk about conservation projects he's working with Audubon California, focused on habitat restoration and enhancement, developing multiple benefit management programs for Central Valley wetlands, agricultural operations, and groundwater recharge projects that benefit both birds and people. In addition, Xerónimo is also the lead for Audubon's Tricolor Blackbird program, conservation program in the Central Valley. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it off to our speaker for our presentation tonight. Thanks for being here.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Xerónimo Castañeda. Thanks for inviting me out to share with you today. Let's see here. Let me share my screen. And we're going to have to go through this again. Let's see. Okay, so do you see presenter mode or?
Nope, it looks good. You're in the presentation.
Perfect. Yeah, awesome. Happy New Year, everyone. Thanks for taking the time this evening to join us for this presentation. It sounds like we're going to hold questions until the end, so feel free to drop them in the chat just so we can track them and so you don't lose those thoughts as they come up. As Emily or as Aaron shared, I'm going to speak today. My presentation is titled Conservation and Drought in the Central Valley, Challenges and Opportunities. And I'd like to share just a little bit more about myself. So I did grow up in California, as Aaron mentioned. I grew up in the peninsula of San Francisco Bay Area. One of my favorite places to visit as a kid was always the marshland out there, the bay wetlands and stuff. And I just remember being so fascinated by the ducks and all the shorebirds and their, kind of silly long legs and long bills and stuff like that. And I never really imagined myself, being where I am today, doing conservation for wetlands, for birds, And so it's kind of a neat, just, backstory and evolution of growing up as a kid, being in love with that type of habitat and environment, and then eventually working to protect it. Okay. So the Central Valley landscape, as we are familiar with or may have heard about, was once this really expansive mosaic of wetlands and upland habitats. And unfortunately, over the past century plus, a lot of that habitat has been lost to urban growth and development, as well as agricultural expansion and conversion. And more recently, the agricultural conversion to non-wildlife friendly crops, such as almonds and vineyards and other tree crops. And then in the last several decades, and particularly the last several years, we have seen that climate change is really acting as a multiplier of any of the negative impacts to what remaining habitat that we have left. And so in this photo, we see a glimpse of parts of the Central Valley and what they used to look like during flood events and moderately wet years. And scenes like this are few and far between. And so now, in a time of extended drought and where people are paying closer attention to the impacts of climate change, we often see the opposite of what we see here. And so Audubon has really taken a strong stance in trying to address these challenges and issues and move us in a direction where we can see these types of natural occurrences again across the landscape. And so here, kind of keying in on wetland habitats, we see this 3-panel map. On the far left is California's Central Valley. Just for reference, it's kind of outlined in yellow, and we see Sacramento up towards the north center part of the map, and then Fresno and Bakersfield. In the middle panel, there's a map that shows the historic extent of wetlands and riparian areas throughout the Central Valley. And we can see that it was pretty extensive. And even in the Southern Valley, there was this really prominent lake that existed, Tulare Lake. And then as we move to the far right, we see that most of that red and blue and green, which highlighted the native habitat, is lost. And it's now covered in gray, which is in this map is agriculture developed lands. And so, and so again, this just is a demonstration of kind of what we've lost and what we're working towards to kind of restore, enhance, and protect what's remaining across the landscape. And so water is kind of an essential key focus for Audubon California. It's essential to everything we do, not only as an organization, but just in our daily lives, drinking a glass of water, watering our plants, feeding, giving water to our pets and our kids. And so Audubon has immersed itself into the world of water, so to speak, and has become a leader, especially in the new face of groundwater work across the Central Valley. And in that work, we really focus to strive to ensure that water, and groundwater in particular, remains a viable option for communities, wetland habitat, and agriculture, and especially more so in years like these last few, where we're in extreme drought. And so we not only work to secure and maintain existing water resources needed to support any remaining critical habitat throughout the Central Valley, we're also building on our work to ensure that future water resources and management decisions appropriately account for water needs of habitat, and that any decisions and plans that are implemented also help create resilience in the water system to ensure there's positive impacts to communities and wildlife. And so, as we are all familiar, water is scarce in California, or it's becoming more scarce in California. And here we see an article from NPR that just kind of that really kind of shows the landscape that we're dealing with when we're in extreme drought. And so Audubon is, again, taking these steps to making sure that water under the ground and water across the landscape helps birds everywhere. And one of those things that we are doing is working with agricultural interests and water districts to create multi-benefit projects. And what I mean by multi-benefit projects, and what's demonstrated in this infograph here, is a project that can provide, in this instance, groundwater recharge. It can provide habitat for wetland species. It can provide water quality benefits, not only for water that's used on agricultural operations, but also as drinking water for communities. And then also to store carbon, pull it out of the atmosphere, put it back into the ground through these operations. And so one of the projects that I've been focusing on in the last few years has been, again, working with a particular water district down in the Tulare Basin to identify priority areas to develop into these multi-benefit groundwater recharge basins, areas that will that are adjacent to existing habitat, so can create a larger area of habitat for those species that are down there. And then also in areas that will provide that groundwater recharge that can then, be a benefit for agricultural users as well as communities. And then one other thing that I've been working on relatively recently has been to kind of address not only water use and water needs of habitat across the landscape, but kind of address what the needs of these managed wetlands are. And so this map here shows where a lot of the national wildlife refuges and the state refuges throughout the Central Valley are located. And the colors that we see here represent the amount of water that is allocated to them each year. And so red and orange is not a lot, and green is better. And so the takeaway here is that these refuges should all show up green on this map, but they're not. And so, even though it's required for them to get this water, there's a lot of moving parts that make it challenging. And one of them is just the kind of the lack of information that we know, or wetland managers know, about the water demands of those particular wetlands and how to maximize water use to create the most habitat. And so another project that I'm working on is to engage with these water managers to develop wetland water budgets. Essentially something like your bank account, where you get so much water, so much money in, you hold it in your checking account, and you kind of spend it here or there to receive things. And so these wetland managers, they bring in X amount of water, and then they have to figure out how to spend that water essentially to create the most habitat benefit. And so we are working with engineers and other consultants to generate these models, collecting data from across the state and across these different wetland complexes to understand kind of what those checking balances of water are. And then we're able to present that to water districts, to different agencies, and say, hey, listen, this is what we need to ensure that these wetlands are providing the greatest habitat value that they can. And so these two particular projects, even though they're at the forefront, they are a little bit more long-term type projects. And so in the meanwhile, something that we know how to do really well, and that we have a proven track record of, is implementing science-based approaches to conservation. And so that that includes our work with rice growers in the Sacramento Valley, where we've worked over the years to develop a program and practices that benefit the rice growers as well as overwintering water birds. And so the Migratory Bird Conservation Partnership, which includes Audubon, the Nature Conservancy, and Point Blue Conservation Science, was successful this last year in securing funds to roll out multiple emergency drought relief programs to benefit water birds throughout the Central Valley. So both in the Sacramento Valley, north of Sacramento, all the way down to Kern County, Bakersfield. And so in coordination with the MBCP partners and other conservation groups, we're really leading this targeted programs that will incentivize farmers as well as private wetland managers to alternatively manage their properties to create new habitat to meet the needs of water birds, which is especially critical in this time of drought. And so the way we are doing that is we're running this bird returns program, which asks landowners to place a bid. You know, how much money or how many resources or how much support do they need to implement and create habitat. And so that bidding process is a way for us to kind of you know, incentivize folks to do it at a cost that is not super high and not super low, but just kind of meets the needs of everybody, something that's reasonable. And so it's actually proven to be pretty successful. Landowners can get pretty competitive with each other, and so it's kind of exciting, you know, to see somebody get excited about winning and then being able to create habitat on the ground. And so through this program, we have been able to offer a winter program in agriculture, again, as well as manage wetlands. And then we're currently working on a spring program that we are busily getting together and hoping to roll out in the next couple weeks. And so for the winter program, we really targeted folks who manage the landscape for ducks. And, you know, ducks are birds, we love ducks, but they get a lot of love, especially from those folks who like to hunt them. And again, it's not a bad thing, it's great, but a lot of those wetlands can be managed in a way that also benefits other water birds. And so these folks, we work with them to develop alternative management practices that then can benefit shorebirds. And one of those, even though the winter is really important for all water birds, we've noticed through our research that the spring or the shoulder season, so kind of late fall and spring, tend to be times of the year where there's minimal wetland habitat across the landscape. And so we've been working and we have developed these practices that encourage these, that provide habitat for these species at those kind of shoulder seasons. And so here we see an example of what we're doing in the spring, or what we're hoping to do in the spring. On the left-hand side of the screen is a dry wetland, and this is typically how those wetlands are managed for duck hunting and for ducks. They flood them in the winter, they pull the water off in February. And the shorebirds really need that water in March and April and May. And so on the right-hand side of the image is where we see a landowner who's enrolled in our program. And you can see there's water, there's habitat, and we know that the birds are keen in on that. And so the more we're able to offer this program, the more acres we can get on the ground and the more we benefit the birds. And so we are, as I mentioned already, in the process of rolling out a spring 22 program. We're going to offer the winter program in 2023 and the spring program again in 2023 as well. And of course, none of this is really possible without the collaborations and partnerships that we've developed over the years. This is just a small sample of those folks that I'm working with more closely over the last few months. And the other partners that are not on here are chapters, and chapters have definitely been a huge key to the success of conservation, both, locally where their chapters are, but then just more broadly. And especially when we do advocacy day and having folks come out to the Capitol, in person or virtually, has always been super fun, and also just great to get everyone out and support the different causes for conservation across the state. So now I'm going to transition to share a bit more about Tricolor Blackbirds and that program. So Tricolor Blackbirds was really a grassroots program. And so folks before me used to knock on doors and have conversations with folks about the birds that they were seeing in the field. And it was really a great way to do it, I think. I mean, what I heard is that it was pretty positive. It had a great impact. And really, I wish I could do that a bit more and get out in the field and interact with landowners and that sort of thing. But over the years, as the situation became more dire for the birds, it became apparent to my predecessors that there was a real need to become more coordinated and to reach folks in a more official way. And so folks realized the best way to educate and outreach to producers was through partnerships. And in this case, with non-traditional partners, so as environmentalists, as conservationists, we don't typically see ourselves as aligning with the agriculture sector. But we approached them and they were receptive. And so now over the years, we've developed a really strong partnership with the dairy association and industry groups. And they're an extremely critical and essential to the success of the Tricolor Blackbird conservation program that we're running. And so before I get into kind of the inner workings of the program and what that actually means, I want to show you a couple nice pictures. And for those of you who are not familiar with Tricolor Blackbirds, just kind of share a little identification tips. The most obvious is for the males, and we can see the comparison here between the male Tricolor Blackbird and RedWinged Blackbird. Overall, the male Tricolor has a deeper, darker black than the RedWing, but the really distinct feature is the white bar that's under the red on the shoulder of the Tricolor Blackbird versus the more kind of yellowish bar on the RedWinged Blackbird. And then, of course, vocalizations are a little bit different as well. And so here we see a field view of the male Tricolor Blackbird, and you can really see that white bar it really pops against the black and the red. And as with many birds, the females are a bit more muted in colors. We see, though, however, that the Tricolor Blackbird female is less streaky than the red-winged Blackbird. The bill is a little narrower and not as robust, and the face pattern is not as distinct. So even though they can be distinguished, it's still pretty challenging to do it in the field. And the best way to do it is during the nesting season, when the Tricolor Blackbirds kind of separate from the rest of the Blackbirds, and then key in on the males when you're out in the field. So here we see a distribution of select years of Tricolor Blackbird colonies across the state. The larger circles represent larger colonies. And we can see that though they do extend through a good portion of the state, the majority of them are centralized in the Central Valley of California. This particular map was generated from data collected during the statewide surveys, 2008 to 2017. And the main reason that they have really centered themselves on the Central Valley is because of the suitable habitat. And so if you recall the image that I showed in the very beginning and kind of description of the valley, it used to be this really extensive mosaic of riparian, wetlands, and grasslands. And so it really provided, all the resources that these birds needed: a place to nest, a place to forage, and so on. And so here we see an example of a Tricolor Blackbird nest in their historic in a wetland. So this is, where they evolved and adapted to live and build their nests. And so they've chose wetlands for a few reasons. The emergent vegetation is really dense. It provides a lot of strong structure for them to build nests that supports them in weather and wind and rain and that sort of thing. And then also the fact that it's over water. It's a deterrent to predators that can otherwise try to get in there and eat the eggs or the nestlings or that sort of thing. And so here is a short little video of birds nesting in their native habitat. And that flight pattern that you just saw, where they kind of went over the road and undulated like that, is pretty diagnostic of the birds when they're moving to and from the colony. And so if you're ever driving around the valley, or you're driving in an area where you see large groups of blackbirds, they do this kind of streamline flight path like that, it's the likelihood that they're Tricolor Blackbirds is pretty high. And so, as I mentioned, a lot of these native and natural wetlands have been lost to agriculture. And in this particular picture, we see it looks very similar to that other one I just showed you. But this particular nest happens to be in a silage field where dairy farmers are growing feed for their cows. And so with the loss of wetlands, these birds have adapted in a sense to find an alternative habitat that provides the similar dense vegetation, the structure of that they would have typically found in wetlands with this tall wheat and grain crop. And then usually there's not water underneath, but sometimes there can be. And so again, it provides good protection from any predators that are trying to get into the colony. And so here is an example of a colony that is nesting in a dairy silage field. Oops, sorry for my videography skills, not the greatest there. But you can see it's, the habitat looks almost the same. The flight patterns are the same. Again, they're just keying in on that dense vegetation to provide that structure for their nests. And here we see a map again, kind of the extent of the colonies throughout the Central Valley. This particular one really focuses on the southern San Joaquin Valley. So that black outline is outlining parts of Kern County, Tulare, Fresno, Merced County. And so all the colored circles are Tricolored Blackbird colonies. And then all the black squares are dairies. And so as I just described with the loss of wetlands, these birds have moved into areas where they're now nesting on grain fields associated with dairies. And so we can see that they're, from this map, that's where they are. They're around the dairies. So of course, you can imagine as birds nest in these agricultural operations, there's bound to be some amount of conflict. And so unfortunately, as the birds are nesting, the chicks are hatched. The timing of that coincides with when the crop is at its peak value nutritionally for the cows, and so the farmers want to harvest, and that is not good for the birds. And so what kind of came from that full circle back to my colleagues recognizing that we need to create a more coordinated effort to do outreach and education and protect these birds. We formed the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, which is funded through the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And Audubon leads that in coordination with Western United Dairies, the California Farm Bureau, Dairy Cares, Sustainable Conservation, and a few other conservation organizations, as well as a couple other agencies. And this has been a 5-year program that started in 2014. And the objective is really to bring together these non-traditional partners to increase the pace and the scale of conservation. And so this was a real prime opportunity for Audubon and these other organizations to come together to try to protect these birds and create a solution. And so our 4 main goals are to protect the silage colonies through harvest management, to work on developing long-term solutions and implement any pilot projects, and then do outreach and education to the dairy community as well as the general public, and then habitat restoration and enhancement. And so what that really looks like on the day-to-day or from year to year, it's a lot of coordination from myself and these handful of partners. There's pre-season meetings and planning to be sure that when colonies are detected, we have kind of a list of steps to take to ensure that the landowner is notified in a timely fashion. They're provided the essential information to let them know that there's a program that can support them in providing technical assistance, as well as any financial assistance that they may need. We conduct surveys. After the planning, we conduct surveys roadside, and we essentially drive miles and miles of the Central Valley trying to find these birds. We do outreach to the dairy producers through our partners, and also if we see folks on the farms themselves. And then we just work with them. We visit their farms, we provide as much support as we can and as much opportunity for them to ask questions and communicate with us, and to really create a positive experience for them. And through the success and the relationships that we've built over that first 5 years of the program, we've been able to protect over 120,000 nesting adult birds across 73 different colonies. And we've been able to enhance or restore over 100 acres of native habitat over those years. And so it really has been a successful program. This past year, we protected 11 colonies on dairies, which amounted to about 175,000 adult birds. That was across 4 counties in the Central Valley, and we were able to enhance about 35 native habitat acres. And as I mentioned, this program was only a 5-year program, which started 2014, 2015. And so it ended, quote unquote, ended last year. But fortunately for us, there was a lot of support from all the partners and the agencies who funded it. And we were asked to resubmit for a renewal of the program, and we were awarded that renewal. And so that means we'll be able to continue this work. And hopefully in the coming years, we can develop a longer term solution than just doing that kind of roadside survey and direct outreach to producers. Hopefully we'll be able to develop more programs to create and enhance habitat across the landscape. But it's a win for us right now. It allows us a little bit more time to work on those things. And so we're pretty excited about that opportunity to continue building these partnerships, continuing to engage the community and to protect these birds. And one other thing that comes out of my work in the Tricolor Blackbird program is engaging with partners to coordinate the statewide survey. And I know that I'm sure that many of you have participated in that in the past or have heard about it. It was really started as an effort to understand the population more broadly and really get a true snapshot of what's going on with the population. Because again, people had these perceptions of declines, but until it was really coordinated, nobody really knew whether or not, no one had the data to really back up the declines. And so it was a survey that was done every 3 years, started in 2008 on a really coordinated basis. And then it was supposed to happen in 2020, but unfortunately we were sidetracked by the pandemic. And it was again delayed last year, but we are planning to host it again in 2022. So if you're interested in participating, feel free to reach out to me and I can connect you with the person who's the lead coordinator. And so in 2017, we surveyed about 178,000 birds across 168 locations in 37 counties across the state. And in this graphic on the x-axis, we see the year, and the y-axis, we see the number of birds. And so it's pretty obvious showing a decline. I do want to point out that in 2014, between 2014 and 15 is when our RCPP, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, really kicked off. And then we have our one data point of 2017, which was about midway through that partnership program. where we kind of see this slight little uptick. With one data point, I can't say that it's because of us, but I would like to think that we had some effect on the population. If anything, at least just stabilizing and stopping significant declines of the population. And so I am really excited for this 2021 or 2022 survey to add another data point to this graphic and to see, are we moving up or are we staying level? And I feel pretty hopeful that we're actually moving up. And regardless of all the efforts that we have put into the protection and conservation of Tricolored Blackbirds, I mean, along with all sorts of other species and habitat, there's continuing challenges, particularly in the Central Valley with the situation with water. And we've lost 95% of Central Valley wetlands, and they're continuing to be threatened from water use decisions and water plans. We're continuing to see land conversion to non-wildlife friendly crops, as well as to urban development. And then just more broadly speaking, water availability and access has become an issue. With changing climate conditions, we're really seeing this boom and bust in when and where our water is. And so how do we get that water to the places that need it the most, not only for wetlands, but also for people? And so through trying to understand these challenges and working through these partnerships, we are continuing to adapt our conservation strategy. And as I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, really digging into this multi-benefit land use and creating multi-benefit projects for water birds, for upland birds, and for people. Through these challenging times, we've developed new partnerships that have been pretty fruitful in what they've been able to accomplish. And then also utilizing new technology. And so there's some exciting work that's going on with the Nature Conservancy and the Department of Fish and Wildlife and some other folks to erect these MODIS towers, these telemetry towers across the state, across the valley, where then folks can apply for a research grant, essentially put little tags on birds or bats or other wildlife to see how they utilize the landscape. And so I'm hopeful that this Tricolor Blackbird working group and conservation program can figure out a way where we can put some tags on some of these birds, especially in these areas that are around dairy concentrations, and just learn a bit more about how they use the landscape across those dairies and near those dairies. And hopefully we can learn enough where potentially we can reduce that conflict. And then of course, create new habitat, protect existing habitat, manage it in a way that provides the most benefit to tricolors and other species. And then as we're doing all of that stuff, continue to protect the most at-risk colonies, especially those ones that are nesting on dairy silage fields year after year. And with that, I'd like to end my presentation and say thank you for your time. And here is my contact information. If you'd like to reach out to me at any time, feel free. And yeah, I'll take any questions.
Hey there, this is Emily speaking. I'm checking out the chat for questions. I know I had initially a few written down for myself, but then you definitely answered things I wanted to learn about. But we have a question from Teresa who's asking, how predictable are the nesting colony locations year to year? And she's curious about the agreements made with the dairies, like if they're like how's the harvesting and nesting coordinated, and are there benefits to the farmers, and like what are the sources of funding? So I guess the first part of that was like how predictable their nesting locations are.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'll go back to that map really quick and show you. I would say that they're really, I mean, they're broadly predictable. I mean, every year they're kind of in this area down here, you know, concentrated in these areas and then kind of scattered throughout. And so we do have these core regions where we focus our efforts. You know, because there are not a lot of trees and it's pretty easy to see pretty far, we're able to locate these big masses of birds. And so we do start our surveys by going back to where the birds nested the previous year. And usually if they're not nesting in that particular like specific location, they might be across the road, or they might be like a quarter mile down the road or something like that. And so, yeah, it's relatively predictable. But I will also say that the last couple of years, we have found new locations in places where that are a little more spread out than they historically have been in the past. And then let's see, the agreements made with the dairies. Yeah, so the way that our program works, as I mentioned, it's funded through the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. And they have an existing program called the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which they've identified hundreds of different conservation-oriented practices. Some of them are a little more agronomic, so focus on like water efficiency or soil health or something like that. And others focus on creating habitat or doing some sort of management that benefits wildlife. And so we were able to tap into that program, identify a particular practice, and in this case, it's harvest management as well as upland wildlife management. And so they have certain practices identified under that title, where then we are able to, you know, when we locate a colony on a property and communicate with that landowner, we say, this is what we would like you to do. If you can do this, you know, then we'll come into an agreement with you. They sign, you know, contract, all that kind of legal stuff. And then we provide that technical assistance to them and let them know when the birds have finished nesting, when the birds are out of the field, and then NRCS pays them essentially to do that. And NRCS, their programs they don't pay 100% of the cost because it's supposed to be something that the landowner you know, would like to do. In this case, it's a little bit different because most of those landowners don't, you know, if they can't harvest their feed for the cows, then they have to get it from somewhere else. And so it is a little bit of a challenge sometimes to work with folks. But for the most part, you know, they understand the need to protect the birds, and it works out. I think maybe I answered that second part of that question too, or the third one. Yeah, and so the benefits to the farmers, as I briefly mentioned, it's not, we're still trying to figure that out a little bit. It's more benefits to the birds at this point, unfortunately. We'd like to be able to support the farmers, but the flip side is the birds are protected under the State Endangered Species Act as they're listed as threatened, and so it's illegal for them to harass or take the birds, kill the birds. And so some people will say, don't give them any support. They just have to do it, which I feel a little bit, conflicted about that. It's like, yes, that's true, but also, it is their livelihood. So we want to just try to, work out a solution, figure out a way that we can support them, because they are trying to make a living, and I enjoy cheese. So, yeah.
Thank you.
And again, yeah, you're welcome. And the funding does mostly come from NRCS, but it does come from other folks. I know last year we did a chapter drive to get kind of commitments from folks in case some of this funding fell through. The agencies, so the state and the federal government, have also stepped up, especially the state more recently has provided some funding to do a lot of this work. So we're grateful for that as well.
Thank you. I just have one more question.
Yeah. No
Is
problem.
the harvest actually lost, or is it just delayed?
Well, so the in the eyes of the farmers, it's lost, because the crop is to get the maximum nutritional value out of the crop, it has to be harvested at a particular time. And it has something to do with moisture content and that sort of thing. And so typically they would try to harvest in March, and that's like peak nesting season. And so as it's delayed, it loses that moisture content, it loses the nutritional value. And so then it's in some cases it's lost depending on how long the harvest is delayed. Sometimes they can salvage some of it. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And we had another question come in from the chat from Robert asking, why is it focused on the tricolored blackbirds? What about like the red-winged blackbirds, if they gave like similar indications on climate and water? Is there like better data from the tricolored blackbirds?
That is a good question. Excuse me. In short, the program was started before I got to Audubon, and so I am just continuing it on. However, I think a reason for that is because what makes tricolored blackbirds unique is that they congregate in these really dense colonies for nesting. And so that makes them particularly susceptible to any disturbance. And in this case, it's a harvest event. And so these colonies can number into 40,000 birds plus. And so you can imagine if you have 40,000 birds nesting, each one has 4 eggs or 4 chicks, and a harvest event happens, that's a huge hit to the production for that year, which has a significant impact on the population. And so, compared to red-winged blackbirds, which, you're correct, they probably do have some strong indications about climate change and water and that sort of thing. However, their biology, they don't congregate in those dense colonies, and so they're not as at risk of population decline as tricolored blackbirds.
Okay. Yeah, looking at the video images, I was kind of curious how you did like counts. Obviously be like an estimates when you're doing the studies. So I guess on like a personal note, like if you're doing the field surveys, how do you kind of come up with those dense population numbers.
Yeah, totally. A lot of practice, and a lot of time. And so it's a lot of, you know, if we can be there really early in the morning and get the first few flights, then you can get a pretty good count. And we're counting by like the hundreds. And once you do it enough, you can see a group of birds and you can be like, okay, that's 200 birds. That's, you know, and be within maybe like 50 to 100. But yeah, it takes a lot of time, and there's definitely been moments where I'm just like banging my head because it's like these birds go off one way and then I think I'm done, and then all of a sudden this other group comes in from the opposite direction, and then the group comes out of the substrate, and you gotta like start all over.
Yeah, because I guess looking at the data points that in the end you mentioned like people could contact you if they want to participate in like the 2022 like statewide surveys for them. But I was also wondering like if eBird contributed to any of the data for tricolored blackbirds.
Yeah, so eBird data played a big role in kind of a comparison analysis between the statewide survey and some other modeling that Cornell did for us, and for the state. And so Cornell took that information and created with this integrated population model, and compared that to our statewide survey data and some other data that was collected from year to year. And you know, the takeaway there was that the trend was going down, and the trend was going down across all data sets in the same kind of like magnitude, the same degree. And so it was just another source that was independent from what Audubon collects, and what the statewide survey says, that confirmed that the population was in steep decline. And so that was useful in helping to advocate for the listing of the bird under the California State Endangered Species Act. But then as far as like participating in the statewide survey, I mean, I'm pretty sure that people will submit because it happens over a 3-day period. And so if you eBird during that 3-day period and you go to particular locations, then they'll probably count that. But there are other metrics that we try to record during the statewide survey. Those include like habitat quality, habitat availability, like substrate type, that sort of thing.
Okay, is there other like public participation in data, or as far as like California Audubon, do they, I mean, would it be like on their website for, you know, some people go to like their local chapters, but like if you go on California Audubon's website, is it like other opportunities for people to kind of be like citizen scientists, or
for Tricolored Blackbirds, or just general?
Generally, yeah.
That is a good question. Not that I'm aware of, but I will bring that up to folks, because it is something that we want to do more of, is engage our chapters, get them more involved in work that we do, and to provide opportunity for folks to share their passion, their expertise, and their time, to protect birds, to collect data, do those kind of citizen science things.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, that was all the questions that came up in the chat, unless you had some or anyone else has some, but
I won't keep you here all night. I could ask more questions, but I was excited to hear about Modus because that's something that's been on my radar. So I might follow up on that at some point because we have a student chapter now too at UCSB that's been interested in potentially a Modus station. So that might be something I try to keep.
Yeah,
on my radar.
definitely. Yeah, I mean, feel free to reach out. Yeah, as I mentioned briefly in the talk, it's a new kind of Modus has existed on the East Coast and elsewhere for a while, and it's slowly kind of making its way into California. The Nature Conservancy, I think, put up about a dozen towers, and the state just put up maybe like 8 or 9, and then I know there are a handful others throughout the state. And so the goal is just to create this really extensive network, which will allow us to learn a lot about the movements of different species, and hopefully, for us, it'll teach us more about Tricolor Blackbirds.
Awesome. Well, we definitely appreciate you coming and sharing your expertise with us. And we always like hearing what Audubon California is up to, since at the chapter level, it's the same thing. Like, I think the state likes knowing what the chapters are doing, and the chapters love hearing what the state's up to. And that's some really cool work that you have going in the Central Valley, and really important work. So we're definitely happy to see it happening.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for having me join you today. Really appreciated sharing and the great questions. And yeah, feel free to reach out if any more questions pop up, or if you want to learn about something else or hear about some other work. And I can definitely connect you with some other folks too, who are doing Audubon conservation ranching stuff or coastal work as well. So
Awesome.
great.
Thank you for coming out, everybody. And the recording will be available on santabarbaraudubon.org. And we look forward to seeing you all next month on February 23rd. Yeah, February 23rd. When we'll have Kristen Hislop from the Environmental Defense Center talking about offshore wind development along the Central Coast. So yeah, we've got some more. And looks like Janice just put the Audubon California website in the chat. So if you haven't had the chance to check that out, we definitely encourage you to go learn more about what we heard about tonight and some of the other initiatives that are happening at the state level. A lot of big stuff going on. But thanks, everybody, and have a good night. Stay safe out there, and we're looking forward to working with birds as best we can in all the formats we can.
Thanks.